Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu and I'm back with another Digimon video. So today I'm going to be talking about pre-releases. Again. So pre-releases is that magical time of the year where a new set is about to come out and we could play with some of the new cards and experiment with what some of the new cards are going to be doing and have, well, a slightly different experience than what Digimon usually offers. So what a pre-release basically is you're going to walk into your store, you're going to buy 6 packs of the newest set, and then you're going to make a 40 card deck with a Digi-Ed deck of 0 to 5 cards, and, well, you're just going to open up those packs and build with what you pull. So it's a very interesting format for Digimon, but unfortunately Digimon isn't necessarily designed for this type of play, and it kind of shows in its set design. But that's a completely different topic, and what pre-release is basically doing is that the round format is going to be Swiss format, so the more you win, the stronger your opponents will be, supposedly, and then your sideboard is going to be cards that you pulled, and you could swap in and out between those cards that you pulled with what you had in your deck. And then you get to keep all of the cards that you open because, well, you opened them, you bought them, and then the only special rule is that the sealed format players can ignore Digivolution or color requirements. So you could basically Digivolve on top of any color and ignore that, but the exception is if a card is referring to a specific color or needs a specific color, then you have to abide by what the card says. So in order to use options, you still need to have a Digimon of the same color on the field, and if a Digimon is referring to, let's just say, red, then you have to have a red card for it to interact with. So that's the big difference, but outside of that, it's just your normal game of Digimon. So the important thing to understand when going into a limited or sealed environment is just knowing and understanding the pool of cards and how they want to be played and all of their interactions. Granted, sometimes you can't necessarily rely super heavily on a lot of their more specific interactions just because what you pull is out of your control, and that's just the RNG or fun aspect, is that RNG just acts as a great equalizer. So looking and understanding at what all of these cards are doing is just a very important thing to do, so that way you could properly evaluate and pick the cards that best support what the set is not only trying to do, but the cards that you're pulling and playing with are allowing you to do. So in Magic, we have an acronym called BREAD. So B stands for bombs. These are basically your big high-end cards, the cards that you have lots of impact, and that will help close the game as quickly as they possibly can. Then you have R for removal. These are the cards that are going to be acting as removal to interact with your opponent's field, so that way you could try to mitigate what they're trying to doing. Then E stands for evasion. In Digimon, this basically means your defensive cards. So it's just cards to help stall out the opponent. Most of the time, this is going to be your blockers and various other defensive tools that just stop the opponent from wanting to aggress. Then you have A for aggro. So these are your lower curve or low to the ground cards that just want to hit as quickly as they possibly can, just to try to close out the game as quickly as you can that way. So these are the cards that also just want to gain you lots of value the turn that you play them. And then D stands for duds. These are the cards that you never want to pick or play just because they're not really doing much, or they're really hard to use just because, well, they're requiring more specific synergies that you might not be able to line up. Most of the time, when it comes to evaluating the overall card pool, you're going to want to look at everything that is rare and below, just because even though the SRs are usually very, very powerful cards, they're going to be the cards that you're not going to be seeing very often, just because, well, they're higher rarity. Same thing with the secret rares. You just want to prioritize looking at the lower end cards in terms of rarity, so that way you could try to best figure out what synergizes very nicely with each other on top of what cards you actually want to be using and can use based on what you pull. So what the set is doing is a little bit different than most of the other sets in a sealed environment. So the big difference between this set and some of the other sets is the overusage and overabundance of hybrid Digimon. The set also has a little bit of a lack of blockers, but at least it still has some normal blockers that you could potentially be using and some interesting ways you could possibly form some new blockers. But I digress outside of the blocker aspect, and the fact that this set is playing around with hybrids and a little bit more specific synergy only kind of harms the sealed experience, but it slightly makes it a little bit different, and it makes it a little bit more fun in case you're actually able to line up some of those synergies. So in terms of a lot of the synergies, as you can see with a hybrid card, they are specifically asking for colored tamers in order to digivolve on top of them. So this top ability is probably not really going to be worthwhile, but most of the time you're actually going to want to try to use the card for its other ways that you can digivolve. digivolve it, which is the flexibility on how you could use your hybrids, because a lot of the cards are still asking for hybrids to be used for their abilities to be useful, and we also do still have some other lower level hybrids that now the other colors have access to. So it's just a really interesting thing to be playing around with, just because of all of the different ways hybrids can digivolve and all of the different hybrids we have in the set. But with all that hybrid talk aside, because that's the theme of the set, usually when you're actually going into building your deck, you're going to want to think about what your win condition is, or how you're going to close out the game. So most of the time, these are going to be on your level 5s and 6s, because those are the most powerful cards with some of the strongest abilities that you could be trying to take advantage of. And usually these are also the cards that are the safest to swing with, because they're also going to be the strongest in terms of DP as well. So this set features a lot of really powerful level 5s and 6s that you could try to build around. Most of the time, you're going to try to build around the fact that, well, this is a hybrid-based set, and we do have lots of ancients that you could be playing with. So ancients generally have some synergy with hybrids, just because, well, they're what hybrids generally digivolve into. So all of the ancients have this on delete ability to be able to play hybrids for free, but it is asking for specific color hybrids, so I necessarily wouldn't count on using that ability all of the time. But instead, it has a other ability that you get for just using the card, which is the one you want to try to take advantage of, just because these abilities are more generically decent. So Ancient Volcanomon, as an example, is a very good card for you to be thinking about using in the context of a limited environment, just because his De-Digivolve 3 ability could be really, really powerful at trying to clear off threats off of the opponent's field. So if they actually did line up a Tamer evolution, then this will take away that Digimon, turning it back into a Tamer, forcing them to try to reuse that Tamer. Otherwise, that Tamer is just going to sit on the field and not really do a whole lot. So this is a really good card to be using as an example, and a lot of the other ancients follow the same type of trend, where it has an on-delete ability that's interacting with hybrids of its same color, and it also has a ability you want to try to take advantage of native to it that will ask for a hybrid, and well, because we could use Rainbow Evolution, it doesn't necessarily matter which hybrid that we're using, as long as we're using a hybrid in tandem with this card, making it some relatively easy synergy to try to line up. But as far as what you want to use in terms of your powerhouse cards or your bomb cards, you're going to want them to be as generically decent as you can possibly think of, so that way you don't necessarily need to rely on synergy to make them relatively useful. So I think as an example of this, Dino Rexmon is going to be one of the more powerful low rarity cards to be using as a very powerful bomb, because, well, he's already relatively strong, he has the ability to potentially make himself stronger, and he doesn't require anything to actually use his abilities. So he is the perfect example of a card you want to be trying to use as a result for what a good level 6 bomb card could be for a limited environment. But there's more to deck building than just taking a look at the bombs and trying to build around your bomb. You also have to think about how you're going to be interacting with your opponent, because sometimes removal can be good enough to help swing the tide of the game into your favor. Removal comes in a whole bunch of different forms, but I just basically boil down removal to negatively impacting the opponent's Digimon on their field. So this could be stun locking, this could be deleting, it's just you trying to stop the opponent's Digimon from really doing anything. So the easiest form of removal to think about is just straight up hard removal, get rid of the card, and then it's not a problem. But we do have soft removal in the set in the form of stun locking, where you could think about using a card like Korikakumon to try to stop the opponent's Digimon from taking any actions, and we do have ways to try to line him up depending if you have that synergy or depending on how they're playing their cards. So there is just a lot of different forms of removal, and a lot of the times your bomb is also going to have some built-in removal, or if your bomb doesn't have built-in removal, maybe you want to prioritize bombs with built-in removal, just because the ability to interact with your opponent is usually very, very important to try to help not only keep yourself alive, but to try to push your own win con forward, because if they don't have anything to interact with you, then, well, they can't really interact with you. But when it comes to deck building, understanding how you're going to be winning is probably the most important thing, but something to think about is also how you're not going to be losing. So not losing is in the form of these evasive or defensive cards, and there's not really a whole lot of defensive cards in the set, so this leads me to believe that this is going to be another relatively fast and aggressive format in terms of how you're going to be playing your sealed decks. So there's only 3 blockers in the set, and well, one of them is the only true blocker of the set. So the true blocker of the set is going to be Digimon, where he is a blocker 100% of the time. It's a good thing he's on a low rarity, so that way you have a very easy time seeing him in your card pool, and you have a very high chance of seeing him. But we do have some other blockers in the form of Darugumon, which is a sometimes blocker because it does require some specific synergy in setup in order to actually gain the blocker ability out of him. And if you don't have that synergy set up, then, well, it's not a blocker and it's not really doing a whole lot for the deck, so he might not even be a card worth considering if you don't have him lined up properly. And then outside of that, the only other card that's allowing you to gain the blocker ability is going to be Bulkmon, and he has the ability to give your higher level Digimon blocker, which is pretty important, but it does come at the cost of a security threshold, and if you can't meet that security threshold or maintain that security threshold, then, well, he's not really going to be doing a whole lot as a blocker either. So the set is going to be another very low-to-the-ground, fast-paced, aggressive set, because we actually have some really decent low-level Digimon that we could try to take advantage of if we want to try to be aggressive with our low levels. So we do have a Vanilla 2-drop as a really good card to just hard play, so that way we could try to keep up the aggression. We do have a level 3 hybrid that could set up some of our hybrid synergies in case we can't necessarily line up our Tamers for both red and for blue, so those are 2 relatively high priority cards just because they can help line up our synergies a little bit easier. And on top of that, we do have a plethora of really efficient cards that we could be trying to play. So we could play something like a Shellmon just because he's an easy card to hard play and he's a decent level for Digimon to be playing around with. And we do have something like Tuskmon where it's not as efficient, but it's still pretty good because he also has a nice when digivolving ability we could trigger easily. So there's just a lot of examples of these mid to low level Digimon where they could help not only get our game plan forward, but could help apply some extra aggression and some decent aggression as well, just because we have multiple different ways on how we could use them. So all of the hybrids are pretty decent to use just because, well, they have a plethora of different ways we can evolve them. If we have the Tamer, that's great. If we don't have the Tamer, then we could still evolve it on top of our level 4s if we want to try to line up the synergies in case we don't have the proper level 3, or we could try to use them on top of level 3s, even though that's a little bit slower. It's still just a relatively decent action to try to think about, just trying to line up and choke the opponent by utilizing your low-level Digimon efficiently. And then on top of that, we have some other relatively aggressive cards to be thinking about playing with that only, again, support this more aggressive line of play and style of play. And then we also do have lots of abilities that are trying to dig out our Digimon, so this also incentivizes us going low to the ground to try to utilize these abilities more. So something like a Pokemon to try to help dig out our Tamers and Hybrids, and even 10 Warriors, which could possibly be our win condition, makes this card a very valuable and highly sought after card for this type of a format. And same thing with Nemon to try to be able to reuse our Tamers, so that way we could try to get as much value out of them as we possibly can, on top of just some really decent card combinations that we could think about playing. So we do have Eismon to help fill up our trash in case we actually do have Susanomon, or we do have some various other tech and tools that we could think about utilizing to optimize us trying to put cards into the trash. And we even have some discard synergy in the form of Eismon to, again, be able to accrue some free value depending on the types of cards that you get and the types of synergies that you see. So again, this is all supporting the fact that you do kind of just want to go low to the ground and seldomly go up to your mid to high stages when you feel like it's appropriate. And then because this is a hybrid-based set, we need some Tamers to be able to play said hybrids. So each of the colors did actually get a tamer to be playing around with, even though Black's is kind of the odd man out because it has nothing to do with hybrids, and it's actually the only memory fixing tamer in the set, so that's something to keep in mind when you're trying to play an aggressive style of deck, is knowing that the opponent isn't going to have very efficient ways of fixing their memory outside of Coda. And Coda also isn't that great of a tamer to be using. He is interacting with X antibodies, but X antibody is a very specific type of synergy that requires very specific cards, and again, if you don't have that synergy in your pool, then it might not even be worth running. Although Coda being a memory fixer is still relevant, especially if you are trying to use the few black hybrids that we got, so he could still be a thing and still see some decent play. But in terms of all of the other tamers, unfortunately the way hybrids work and are worded is you do need the specific color of tamer to be able to digivolve that tamer into the hybrid, so you do kind of have to try to run some of these cards, but because there's not really a whole lot of tamer interaction, you could actually afford to run these cards and not really waste that much time or effort into them, just because you could play it, set it, forget it, and then when it comes in handy, it's there for you. But blue does have a little bit of an advantage because it actually has two tamers that it plays with, and it does have a little bit more hybrids as a result. So if you're looking to play lots of hybrids, try looking to see if you have lots of blue hybrids and your blue tamers to accompany them. And then on top of that, if you're able to get some of these synergies off, then you could be rewarded very well. So Takuya and Koji are two of probably the best tamers that we could take advantage of. Koji is kind of interesting because he's interacting with the hand, and Takuya is interacting with the trash. So their main ability states that you get to place 5 hybrids in their form from your trash and Koji from your hand underneath Takuya to be able to digivolve into Emperor Greymon and Koji Magna Garurumon from your hand as if the tamer was a level 5 red Digimon. So this is pretty unique of an ability compared to all of the other tamers because you don't actually have to digivolve into the level 6 in order to put cards underneath it, so that way you could try to shove cards underneath it, save it for later, and have a very powerful Digimon to be playing around with when you actually see a card to be able to digivolve on top of the tamer. So those are two very interesting interactions that you could try to set up because it's asking for just hybrids, so we could actually use the hybrids of any color, and that's what's making these kind of interesting cards to be playing around with. And again, if you're able to line up the level 6s and actually are able to pull the level 6s, then that's just the icing on the cake, being able to make some very powerful plays just because these warp type of abilities are usually very, very strong. And then, as I stated before, looking at the synergy within the set is usually something relatively important because it helps assess and evaluate what cards you want to be playing, if you could even play certain cards. So unfortunately, I do think because of the way X antibodies work in this set, X antibodies might not necessarily be the best type of support that you want to be playing around with. Although the interesting thing to note is we do actually have an X antibody in the form of Dino Rexmon, so there is a little bit more extra usability with the cards that are referring to X antibodies. It's just not necessarily something I would 100% count on, just because, again, the support is more self-included into what the black package is trying to do. And then any card that's referencing a specific card usually is something you want to try to stay away from, but if you're able to meet the synergies, then I would definitely think about playing them, just because you already have the baked-in package. Unfortunately, if you don't have the full baked-in package, it might not necessarily be the best thing to run, just because all of the synergy isn't there, even though you do have part of it. So synergy is definitely something to look out for. Purple usually has some relatively high synergy, so purple is also interacting with tamers, so finding your purple tamer is going to be super important for playing lots of purple cards. Otherwise, you might want to shift your resources and your deck into a slightly different direction. And then I already stated this with a lot of the hybrids, that the hybrids are something you need to use on top of your specific tamers, but some of the other hybrids you could use generically just because, well, they have multiple different ways on how we could use it, so even though we might not be able to use it one way, we could still use certain cards a completely different way, especially with Rainbow Evolution. So we could use something like a Jaeger-Loemon on top of something like a Grumblemon, in case we're able to line up that type of synergy. A lot of the hybrids do have some flexibility on how we could use them, depending on what hybrids and tamers you're able to see and able to pull. So, as I previously stated in the video, Digimon sets aren't designed for the sealed or limited experience, which is why usually it's going to feel really clunky and awkward. Japan designs these sets for constructed play, and everywhere else is trying to adapt it for sealed play, and there's lots of examples on why Digimon isn't necessarily meant for a sealed experience. Not saying it can't have a sealed experience, because it definitely can, it's just the card game's set design isn't focused around that type of experience. So what Digimon set design generally does is they'll have a core theme that they're going to be building around, and then a couple of random cards here and there to try to just give each color some generic tools, or a specific color generic tools to work with to help try to push the color forward. And then outside of that, you're just going to have a small sprinkle of cards that are either going to prelude decks that are going to be forming in the future, or updating some decks that we previously already had in other sets. So in this set specifically, we have a couple of update cards that are trying to help push previous decks forward and keep them meta relevant for the BT07 meta. But in the context of a sealed experience, these cards are actually detracting and making the sealed experience worse because, well, we can't actually use the cards the way the cards are meant to be used. So we have Huckmon here as a prime example, where he's going to be interacting with Sistermons, and even though, yes, we do have some Sistermons in the set, we can't actually make use on many, if any, of their abilities, just because they're asking for very specific cards that are going to be outside of the set. So Sistermon Blanc Awakened, as an example, is asking to be played with Sistermon Blanc, which is a card that's outside of the set. So we can't even make use of her on playability, even though we can make use of her on delete ability. It's not the way that it's supposed to be played, just because we only have one card in the set that it's going to be interacting with. And then Sistermon CL Awakened is following that same trend, where it wants to be interacting with a card from outside of the set, and the card inside of the set just only adds a little bit of playability to the card, and you're still probably just better off using any other card to try to help actually push what you're trying to do forward, rather than rely on this small tiny baked-in package. And the same thing could be said true for Eosmon, where she's trying to interact with other Eosmons, but she's the only Eosmon in the set. So the likelihood of you having two of these Eosmons on the field to try to get any value out of the card is very unlikely, on top of the fact that it is still also trying to interact with cards outside of the set, makes it a really bad card to think about trying to use for a sealed experience, unless you literally don't have any other level 6 to be playing with. So this, for all intents and purposes, is going to be a vanilla level 6, and in a sealed experience, you want to try to get as much value out of your cards as you possibly can, and this card is not adding any value to the deck whatsoever, outside of just being a level 6 in case you don't have any. And the same could be said true with Chaosdramon, where for all intents and purposes, this card is going to be a vanilla level 6. Its stats are a little bit better, you're paying a little bit more for a little bit higher DP, but I digress, and the way that the card wants to be played is referring to cards outside of the set, making its overall playability rather low. There is a little bit of interaction with this card in the set with the Metal Greymon that we have, but the Metal Greymon is a super rare, so the likelihood of actually lining up the synergy is going to be rather rare and not necessarily worth trying to think about. But it's examples like this that happen every single set that kind of just drive the sealed experience down and kind of sours it, just because there are plenty of cards that are referencing cards outside of the set, and the sets are starting to get a little bit more specific in terms of the synergy on how cards are wanting to be played. Not saying that having synergy is a bad thing, it's just the more specific the synergy, the more narrow the card becomes, and the more narrow the card becomes, the harder it becomes to use in a environment where you're not necessarily going to see its parts and pieces to make that card functional. But as far as my overall thoughts on how I think the BT07 sealed format is going to be played, I think it's going to be another relatively aggressive low to the ground format, just because there's not really a whole lot of ways for the opponent to actually stop some of your aggression, outside of them having a ridiculous security and utilizing lots of removal effects, except usually options are a little bit on the harder side to want to play, just because they do need that specific color, and if you don't have that specific color, then you can't necessarily play it, unless, again, they're really lucky and it just pops out of their security, which you can't necessarily trust. Granted, I do think the difference in tamers and the tamers that you could see in how hybrids work do make options a little bit more playable, just because you could set a tamer, forget about it, be able to use that color option, and be able to use that tamer when you have the hybrid for it when you're ready and if you see that card. And I do think a lot of the hybrids are going to be very, very powerful cards to be using. The big ones to highlight is going to be Korikakumon for that Stunlock ability, and Jet Sylphimon for that recovery ability. Outside of that, the rest of them just don't really seem like they're doing that many interesting things. Purple already has lots of baked in synergy, so just the purple ones with any of the other purple cards are going to be relatively good to think about using. So I think this is going to be a pretty interesting and fun sealed experience, just because, like all of these sealed experiences, it's a completely different way that you're playing the game, and each set has its own approach to deck building on what you want to play and what you should be prioritizing. So that's all I really have for this video. As always, feel free to tell me your thoughts down in the comments below, and down in the description below are a couple of different ways you could support me and the channel. So I do have a TCG Player affiliate link, so when you use that link to buy cards off of TCG Player, then some of that money will go to supporting me and the channel. I also do make and sell playmats over on Overcard Gamers on Facebook, so when you buy a playmat with my design, then some of that money will also go to help supporting me and the channel. And on top of all of that, I do have a Twitch account over on twitch.tv/Zenitsu, so giving me a follow and a subscription also helps support me there, and I do play Digimon on top of various other games on that platform as well. So thank you everyone for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next video.